It's my great pleasure to welcome to our 2021 Online Trend Summit long-term collaborator and friend of the Food People, Amelia Boothman, Strategy Director at 1HQ. Welcome, Amelia. It's fabulous to have you join our speaker lineup once again this year.
Thanks, Charles. It's lovely to be here again.
Amelia is going to bring to life the cultural driving forces and the human narrative behind the top trends for 22-23, and how and why we're moving from the era of owning the reset to this new era of conscious control and how that's manifesting. If you're participating today as a Trend Hub subscriber, you can immerse in the detail behind this keynote with the supporting presentations and videos in the 2022-2023 social and cultural trend predictions on Trend Hub. So Amelia, let's unpack some of the forces behind the food and beverage mega trends for 22-23, get into that behaviour that is at the root of those manifestations as we move forward. I'll hand over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Charles. And what an exciting year we have ahead. Well, thank you very much, Charles, for inviting me to present this again. It's been really exciting analysing the trends with our semioticians to unearth those cultural drivers. And I'm just going to start off by introducing a little bit about the importance of cultural trends before I get into this year's most exciting drivers. And I've cherry-picked the ones that we feel are perhaps new or particularly important in driving the main macro trends that we can see this year. But first off, why are we bothering to do these cultural trends and not just talk about the food and drink trends that are manifested from them? So the true meaning of a brand or service actually comes alive through the visual and verbal and the atmospheric and experiential ways in which it's delivered. So each sign, code or symbol can tell a different cultural story through the context it puts itself in. Take, for example, the simple hamburger here we can see. It can be one from Impossible Burger or McDonald's or a 3-star Michelin restaurant. And each has a very different value and meaning, of course. And it's these subconscious messages delivered through the pack design, decor, communications, menu, atmosphere, the visual format, which all bring the experience to life in a very, very different, meaningful way. And also, one thing I was just going to share with you is how we actually come to identify these. It's not a dark art. It's really about understanding culture and what's going on in society that's making us want these things. Obviously, the food people yourselves identify and gather these really interesting trends and analyse them every year and their strength across the world. Then we at 1HQ take the imagery and the context of those, the signs, codes and symbols, and unearth the meaning and the culture behind them to enable our clients to signal them more effectively through the different signs, codes and symbols and levers that can make them come to life. Today, though, we're going to take you through those big culturally shifting stories as a bit of interest so that when you can see we're working with clients, there is a meaning and a driver behind the semiotics, the signs, codes and symbols. But when we actually work with clients, we translate these into their unique innovation platforms. And we instead focus on how to bring those to life in each brand or product's context in their own way. But today, we're going to talk about these big stories, these really exciting stories. And our big global theme this year is conscious control, which is fascinating. And underneath this are a number of macro cultural trends that help to explain those food and beverage trends we see. This is our macro cultural trends map. Don't worry if you can't read it, it is all on the hub in the detail, so you can delve into that afterwards. But you can see here conscious control at the centre, and then out come from that the big macro drivers and themes behind it. And there's a number of emotional needs and behaviours, and it can explain why we actually desire and want these new food trends. Some are going to feel very familiar because they're ever present, but their influence has been dialed up because of the circumstances that we're in. Others have emerged that we maybe haven't seen before. And then others maybe don't feel completely new, but have gone away and then now have come back again. Let's start though by having a little look at the center of this wheel. So conscious control, our big global driver. So why is this happening? And What is it all about? Well, as we begin to understand the extent of the need to treat the planet and people on it with more respect, we're now accepting greater societal and personal controls. Previously, we have welcomed much more the idea of individual freedom to choose, to be able to do what we want and to be who we want to be. However, the continued evidence that this is creating an ever more unfair and unstable society is actually driving the belief that the structure of the state should play a greater role in reining in the excesses of those who refuse to recognize this, and that change is actually required to make life more palatable for the human race as a whole. Let's now delve down and have a look at some of those macro trends behind conscious control and the cultural drivers within that. So first off, we have our first one as food democracy. And in a time of extreme uncertainty and change, counterculture has actually risen up and introduced new thoughts, principles, and concepts to overcome the challenges, such as the growing acceptance of lab-grown foods to solve society's problems. The pandemic has also revealed a global social underclass of poorly paid key workers from all parts of society across the globe. Those who were unseen and taken advantage of previously have been cast into the limelight, and our sense of fairness seeks to give them dignity, fair representation, and access to the same rights and benefits as all of us. We've also seen a shift in influence in terms of culture, with the cultural global dominance of the West now being heavily influenced by the Far East. We've seen things like streaming dramas such as Squid Games are now bringing the East into all our homes. And also with the continual global hybridization of food, this has actually integrated new global tastes into all our lives, into ways that we've never understood before, where they're becoming ever present in all of our taste and food profiles. So our first question is, why has food now embraced new tech-fueled solutions so readily? Let's have a look at the drivers behind our first mega trend, which is easy access and hyper-pragmatism. So our first driver is Homo pragmaticus. Opposing our principle of doing things the right way, or like the old days, is that of finding pragmatic solutions in the here and now. And humans have always evolved to be highly flexible in our survival strategies. And this includes in relation to food. And under increasing stress, such as in the recent pandemic upheaval and the global environmental drivers, our instinct to survive using whatever means necessary is activated much more strongly than in times of tranquility. We also see shape-shifting becoming standard. So if we take, for example, brands used to be anchored originally in particular products and almost became pseudonyms for products. Then the service economy emerged in the 70s, and that made brands increasingly tied to particular services. But today, brands are much more abstract, and they increasingly are centered on what Simon Sinek talks about as the idea of why they are doing things, not the what or the how. And this actually liberates brands to make their offerings more fluid. We also see the driver of welcoming control, as we've just mentioned. So a seismic and little appreciated development in civilization has been the advent of things like driverless cars and the algorithms driving our surfing choices, as discussed in the Social Dilemma Netflix documentary, which is fascinating if you haven't seen it. Tech has been an ever-increasing presence in our lives, but a Rubicon has now been crossed because we as individuals are now willing to put up with our lives being entirely in machines' hands. And this acceptance has unconsciously led to a radical increase in the acceptance of greater control in general over our lives. We definitely now see this in food. So what does this mean for food? Well, automation in food is thus becoming accepted and welcomed as never before. We see things like drone pizza delivery in Israel, on-demand ultra-fast grocery delivery by apps such as Getir in the UK, seamless ordering and pickup from the Brooklyn Dumpling Shop in New York City, robot-made food, France's Pazza Pizza is describing this. We see in Switzerland, Smythe doing this in the world of drinks. And they're all empowering our pragmatic selves and impressing us with their innovative new ideas. So let's have a look at our next big trend. And this macro trend is make me stronger. So we are increasingly trusting the latest science to uniquely protect and enable each of us to achieve our greatest potential. So obviously, health and food has been intrinsically tied for centuries, but we're actually now seeing a cult of wellness, and food is being transformed into the embodiment of this principle. Developments in science and technology have proven to us that we can significantly affect change in our body's performance, health, and longevity through our diet and eating habits. This is dramatized brilliantly in the highly successful Game Changers documentary on Netflix as well. This has advanced now beyond just healthy eating, which has been around for a very long time, but it's now being flipped to become the concept of eating for health, so as to even slow aging and cure or prevent disease. And as further research is constantly becoming available, we are therefore increasingly seeing the use of food to master and transform the self. So that leads us to the question of why is food increasingly becoming targeted for highly specific personal needs? Well, our next big macro trend is on target in science that we trust. And our cultural drivers behind that start with the idea of targeted solutions. So the notion of giving each of us dedicated solutions to our health and life problems precedes the modern trend for individualism that we see now. So for example, we've had shamans with claims of precise analysis of the self and capacity to provide specific advice for key life moments around for millennia. And they show this notion of individually tailored solutions. And this is really such a strong tradition in the human story that it's not new at all. In fact, we're always really seeking this. But now we see efficacious medicine. So while we know medicine is designed to target specific physical issues, the pandemic has put a huge attention and focus on the validity of research and development processes for things like vaccines and other treatments. And for the vast majority of us, this has just confirmed the phenomenal effectiveness of modern science and technology in its ability to protect us and make us healthier. In parallel, we've also seen in recent times fascinating research into the microbiome. And that's really shifted our understanding of just how unique each of us is. So one size may fit all for some things like vaccines, but as individuals have been discovered to be more in a constant state of flux. And now we know that each of us has a unique biological fingerprint. Not only are gut microbiota complex and subject to improvement through intervention, but there's an increasing evidence set that sort of links this status of our microbiome with our mood and physiological states. I don't know if anyone's signed up onto the Zoe microbiome food diet app. You can only get it in certain areas, but this is fascinating. Professor Tim Spector of King's College is running this great study alongside his COVID tracker, which enables people to actually tailor their food and diet to maximize their health and well-being. So in food, we therefore see precision food, which is echoing these developments in two ways. Firstly, it's leveraging the confirmation that modern science can really help our health in a measurable way. Foods like Snacked, for example, are protein-rich pre-packaged snacks for kids to capitalize on this. But second is the idea that we are each uniquely biological entities, and that's filtered into the collective consciousness that's manifesting in food, offering subtle and precise recipes fit for us as individuals. And more companies are promising to tailor all sorts of things, not just supplements, to enable us to live our best lives. Let's now move on to our next big macro trend, which is the green life. There is a growing realization that we will all have to take responsibility for our individual carbon footprints in order to help prevent the global climate catastrophe. And now food is becoming an important part of that. Previously, consumers, when we researched them, often just talked about plastic, driving cars, or flying on planes. But now food is becoming part of that conversation. And we're recognizing that if we don't mind our step and rein in our consumption and emissions, there may be nothing left behind. What's interesting is a new greener life is therefore now becoming cool, and engagement in the kindness economy is becoming a status symbol to be overtly displayed without the past concerns of being labelled as a bit of an eco-hippie weirdo that was previously feared. This also now includes the acceptance that lab-produced food can enable us to have it all, a safer planet, and still eat the foods that we love. So this leads to our question of why are we welcoming artificial and synthetic food forms as never before? So our big macro trend here is around future saviours and this ethical artifice enabling this. So our first cultural driver is around this counterintuitive avoidance. So instinctively, we want to eat things that are tasty and or nutritious. But a universal strand in culture is a refusal to consume all the food that could be consumed. Symbolic religious ethical categories often render some edible foods off limits, from sacred cows to pork and cats and dogs. And this may make no adaptive sense, but it does have a strong psychosocial resonance. We also see alchemical efficacy. This is also a well-worn cultural path of exploring cutting-edge technology to surpass what is straightforward that human nature would normally allow. Alchemy from ancient Egypt through to China and India, and then revived in Europe in the 15th century, got its allure from the widespread idea, derived ultimately from even more ancient sorcery, that with expert craft and manipulation of matter, we could outsmart nature for the benefit of mankind. And so we see synthetic authenticity. So after the scientific revolution, all but extinguished society's belief that technology can help to construct other realities, we actually see the embrace of possibilities of magical manipulation through science. And we actually see that we can create more real ideas of how we can help us survive in the future using this sort of virtual reality. And with virtual reality, gaming, and the ever more blurred lines between tech and humans, unreality is once again being taken seriously as a mode of being, thinking, and experiencing the world. And we can't ignore the new metaverse that Facebook has decided to rebrand itself to as a really interesting example of that. So that leads us to unnatural goodness. So today, the whole idea of eating in an unnatural way is being recoded as positive in light of the environmental emergency. Now it's not only acceptable to eat alternatives to meat, fish and dairy, it's actually becoming more ethical. Synthetic cellular sushi-grade salmon and other lab creations, rather than freakish products of late capitalism, are ways of saving the planet for future generations. Our next question around the same subject of our new green life is, why is ethically sound food now more desirable than ever? And this leads us to our next macro trend of mind your step and kindness being the coolest. So first of all, destructive status signaling throughout history was that luxury living has been inexorably tied to destruction, with high status signaled through conscious consumption, often involving what amounts to socially admired vandalism, from Greek plate smashing at weddings, which was originally a means of conveying the ability to destroy things that only the wealthy could afford, to gas-guzzling cars that destroy the environment. The coolest and sexiest signals have often been damaging to the world. But now there's this new cultural win-win. For what may be the first time, technological advances are enabling people to enjoy the finest things culture has to offer and to signal such consumption to others, but without damaging or destroying anything. Indeed, increasingly, most exclusive and expensive products have been explicitly green in their credentials, such as Atomi's apple, peel, and leather handbag, for example. And this is a win-win. You can be the coolest in town whilst also saving the planet. Predictable inversions are that part of this is how the elite culture embraces radical inversions of what is considered desirable. So often in haute couture, it decides what is trendy before the masses can accept the new reality. In the way that shoulder pads became fashionable in the 80s, then became the height of uncool, and then became extremely trendy again, and so on. And in this way, we get food upside down. In the world of food, therefore, ethical anti-destructiveness is now increasingly valued. Moreover, things which were once seen as either downright unethical or highly unappealing are inverted. So, for example, the avocado show in Amsterdam presents avocados as now ethical food. And while frozen and dried food, once not appealing at all, are now being transformed, frozen smoothies, dried plant-based mints, they're all being seen as highly ethical and now desirable. Our next question around the green world that we're looking to live in is, why has there been an increasing desire for food that is sustainable and doesn't damage the environment? Seems like an obvious question, and it leads us to our macro driver of leave no trace and this return to need. So previously in human culture, we had the hunter-gatherer balance. So in the collective consciousness or unconsciousness, subconsciousness, there is an understanding that human beings are actually not naturally wasteful. In fact, we lived for tens of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers in fine balance with the environment, respecting and even venerating nature and carefully coexisting with flora and fauna. And this meant little or no waste of resources, cleverly using and reusing technology and food. But then what happened was civilized waste. And this balance was disrupted with the advent of settled agricultural societies, fueled ideologically by beliefs in the dominion of man over nature. And the last few thousands of years have seen the idea of massive waste production and disposal as normal and unproblematic. In addition, high status signaling traditionally leverages what we call Veblen goods, which are artificially expensive products that are intentionally wasteful of resources. But the great shift that we're now seeing is this aspirational minimalism. Not only is the climate emergency making waste reduction more important for many, it's prompting a wholesale rethink of what we really need anyway. And we've seen things like the explosion of micro houses or tiny houses, which show an appetite for hyper-functional living with minimal environmental damage or waste. And so today, wanting and using less is becoming the ultimate aspiration for many, a kind of paradoxical luxury. And so we see this in food and humankind's balanced diet. The idea of living in balance with nature, which means we must stop damaging and polluting it. And this is being supercharged with needless packaging and ingredients being jettisoned in favor of harmonious alternatives. For example, the world's first gin in a paper bottle by Silent Pool distillers shows how radical this thinking is getting. And there's many, many more examples of this in the wonderful trends that we've got this year. But that now leads us to our fourth and final big macro trend. And with every trend, there's often an equal and opposite trend. And here we see blissful escape. In a constrained and uncertain time, we believe we've earned indulgence. And this drives the need to engage the senses, powering even more extreme experiences. Psychologists have noticed in the past that trauma can in some way be overcome by escape through blissful and imaginative visions, and food companies are turning these fantasies into reality. We're increasingly looking for experiences that will take us away from the troubles of reality, moments of transportation that enable us to seek refuge in other less mundane fantasies. Permissible indulgences are also being framed as mindful, as a positive, enjoying the blissful immersion in simple experiences. So why is there a newfound drive in foods towards sensory pleasure? So our macro trend is this go for it and indulgence. And the cultural drivers behind it start with rewarding the brain. So human behavior is governed by the reward system in the brain, also known as the mesolimbic pathway. Whenever you plan to do something pleasurable, like eating nice food, dopamine is released there. incentivizing you to do that thing again. And recent research has found that novel and surprising experiences also release dopamine. Therefore, novel, surprising food experiences will have a double powerful effect. We also see post-traumatic hedonism. In times of deprivation, disease, or war, which were typically followed by some kind of lust for enjoyable experiences. For example, in the Roaring Twenties, this followed the greatest trauma in hundreds of years, World War I. The same can be said for individuals who suffer some kind of trauma. They often gain a new lease of life and start to do things they always wanted to, but were reluctant or afraid to. And finally, mindful indulgence. Today, the mindfulness movement is having far-reaching effects on notions of personal development. Rather than focusing on denial and asceticism, mindfulness is being framed as a positive indulgence, the blissful immersion in simple experiences. For example, eating a raisin and feeling full as a result. The new playground in food, therefore, is where all this combines to make food and drink a perfect space in which to indulge in a way that feels earned and entirely permissible, even advisable. New, phenomenal and exquisite sensory experiences feel the least we can all expect in the reopened world, such as Air Up's aroma pods that trick your brain into imagining the water is flavoured. This is a sensory experience that is then combined with play. So this brings us to the final questions that we're often asked by our clients, which is, how do we apply these trends to make your unique set of innovation platforms? And the issue with trends is everyone's got loads of them, and we've got some amazing ones here for you this year. But which should you use, and how do you implement them to your brand in a unique way? And it's the semiotic codes that can be carefully selected to represent the unique meaning of your brand in culture and society. Overlay these with the food codes, and together you get your own special, unique proposition. That may sound very clever, but in fact, you already have many of the ingredients to do that within your business. It's just creating the right jigsaw puzzle and then implementing that consistently. And how do you do that? Well, you've got these identified overarching macro cultural and food and beverage opportunity areas. You then decide which of those macro trends relate to your brand context and workshop these opportunity areas, plus the food and beverage trends identified with the brand teams. And that can then create the pipeline for your activation pathway for all of your touch points, be it packaging, product innovation, etc., communications, and that works through all of the touch points in the brands. So that's how we do it, and that's just a little top line on all the interesting big trends that we've seen this year in terms of the cultural drivers. So thank you once again, Charles, for asking me along here again this year. And if there's any questions, we'd love to answer them.
Amelia, wow, thank you so much for that insight behind this new era of conscious control and those underpinning cultural forces, the food democracy, Make Me Stronger, the green life and blissful escape. Lots of exciting human and cultural narrative to support the trends framework for 22-23. Once again, a great pleasure to welcome you as the keynote speaker to our 2021 online Trend Summit. Amelia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.